First, I want to have a little discussion just about the expectations for the paper. I think we've communicated those quite a few times, but here what I want to do is just go over the rubric that I've given the TAs to evaluate the material, and I hope it emphasizes just the same sort of things that I've been saying so far. I'm going to give you the rubric on the next slide. No worries. I just thought it might be worthwhile going through it, and I could respond to any questions that you folks might have. Or if you have further questions, you could just reach out to me and I can clarify those for the class. Okay, so first off, I want to start and talk about the assignment rubric. Next, so the material this week, Teodor Mladenov is my buddy who's written a lot of the material we'll look at this week. What I want to look at is the independent living movement or the independent living model at the global scale. So we've already kind of talked about independent living when we looked at the Center for Independent Living in Berkeley, California. But now we're going to look at independent living at the global scale. So Teodor Mladenov is very closely associated with the European independent living movement. They've written some really important reports and stuff that are cited in the readings this week. But what I want to do is look at the relationship between the independent living movement today and globally and the Convention of Rights of Persons with Disabilities, or CRPD. This is the United Nations sort of document organizing how member states should deal with disability. And so this is kind of the level at which we're going to engage the independent living movement today. So we're not talking about the independent living movement in Berkeley, California, but we're talking about how those goals have kind of been brought to the international sphere. Okay, and then finally, in the third section, I want to sort of explore some of the arguments that Mladenov and his colleagues are making about what are the goals of this movement? How do we make sure that the independent living movement at the global scale represents the needs of disabled people, just like it did in Berkeley, California in the 60s and 70s? And what are some of the problems of interpretation that he wants to deal with? Okay, so I think you probably have a good understanding of what the independent living movement and independent living model is, letting disabled people be in charge of their destinies. But we're going to look at some of the problems that come up both at the global scale and in terms of the economics of the issue, as well as some of the more existential problems about meaning, experience, and interpretation. And that should all make sense as we keep going through the lecture. Okay, so I'm going to put online the assessment categories that you can see here. And I noted the comment and I will respond to that comment right after this, okay? So the 5 assessment categories, as I've talked about throughout the course, are going to be based on introduction and argumentation, the organization of your paper, the way you describe the model, the way you describe the disability text, and spelling, grammar, and citation, okay? So I'm not going to say that each of these categories gets 20%, as if everything is spelled perfectly, but you don't have any content, you're going to get 20% on your paper. I don't want to say that, but what I have instructed the TAs to do is to say, look, this paper, how does it fit into, you know, these kind of assessment rubrics? And, you know, you should be able to infer, looking at these, what a very strong paper will do, right? So if you look at introduction argumentation, a strong paper will clearly define its scope of analysis. It'll clearly define what the structure of the paper is, and it's going to set you up to go through the paragraphs to follow and let the reader know what's going on, okay? So as I've said throughout this course and through any others that I've taught, effectively, we need to know in the introduction what your paper is going to do, what we're going to read, and the order in which it's going to follow. Okay? As I've said for the papers in this course and in others, I think organization is really the best It's the best way to determine the quality of the paper, and I think it's also really sort of indicative of the work that's gone into the paper as a whole. So here we're focused on paragraph structure. That is, are they coherent? Are they focused on a single idea? Or if multiple ideas, they're unified by a single thread. And this is underneath the camera. There's an easy transition to follow. Okay. For this assignment, we're focusing on the model of disability and the disability text. So this will be the kind of substantive, 40% or around that space will be focused on the model and the text. And then finally, spelling, grammar, and citation. For the most part, these are easy marks, but I'll just ask that you sort of follow the overall structure for the stipulation that you would cite 2 course papers, 2 from the list of journals, and 1 external one. Of course, that's not a hard and fast rule, but ultimately, I want to make sure that if you are focusing on the lectures, you're using them to supplement that material rather than the other way around. Okay, so one of your colleagues used my fancy new tool to ask for grading, RTAs randomized for who grades which students. Does this change throughout the course? Do we have TAs grade each paper? So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to have there are 2 TAs, so everybody will get marked by everybody, with the exception that since I'm the instructor, I obviously will grade a certain portion of the material, but I think you can expect that you'll have your material graded by everybody. I will let you know if that sets off any warning bells. We did have a meeting on Friday. I've given TAs exactly the same criteria on the rubric that you've seen here, and I'm going to ensure that we all grade through exactly the same sort of way of seeing, right? So comments are going to be organized according to the 5 criteria here, and we're able to talk about a grade if we need to, but you should be able to determine what your grade is based on the comments, 1 sentence for each of these 5 criteria, okay? Are there any other questions about the paper assessment? You can use the chat if you'd like, or you can use that anonymous submission tool. As I said, I'm going to take everything that's on this slide and put it in a Microsoft Word document for you. You've already got a pretty good basis of what you need the assignment to do. I think I've given a sort of extensive discussion about it, and hopefully knowing the assessment criteria will allow you to write the best paper possible, okay? I did want to note, if you look at the grading breakdown, the grades get a little heavier at the end. I think this one's worth 31% and the last one's worth 36%. So we still have a little bit of wiggle room if you're still figuring out exactly how to get the most out of these assignments. I also wanted to say, like, since every one of the 3 assignments has a 5-page paper associated with it, the rubric's just going to look like this, but content 1 and content 2 will shift per assignment. Okay, so if there are no further questions there, or no immediate questions there, we can go through the sort of lecture material. Sorry, and then before we do, one of your colleagues asks, is there a way for us to know who our TA is beforehand so we can ask questions, or should you email me? Email me, and the reason is because I've kind of cooked up this assignment off the top of my head, and I want to make sure that everybody gets exactly the same instructions. And if you need to appeal to me because you want to talk about your grade, I know what I said, okay? So please contact me directly. I'm always happy to talk with you folks. Okay, so let's move on to the lecture material. Okay, so as I said earlier in my blurb, the focus of this lecture is going to be on the independent living model. And what I want to do is to think about, what does it mean for independent living as a movement, or the independent living model, disabled folks being in charge of their own destinies? What what does it mean for that to go to the global level? So here we're talking about the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, right? So this is effectively an international agreement between member states that says we're going to try to inform our policy or have our policies align with a bunch of shared principles. Okay? Today's focus is going to be on section 19, which has to do with independent living, because this is the section that the Mladenov piece, the more recent one, speaks about. It was a lecture or a speech to the European Parliament about the implementation of section 19, which we're going to go through. But I also kind of want to think about what does it mean to talk about disability rights and independence at the global scale? And what are some of the problems that are going to come up? Okay, so if anybody wants to do their paper on the Convention of Rights with Persons with Disabilities, it's not terribly long, and I think it really does show a really aspirational model of disability inclusion. But with any international treaty, I don't know if any of you have been paying attention to the sort of World Economic Forum stuff or the news in general, there are a lot of endemic problems that don't really exist at the local level. Why I say that is because independent living started in California, and it started with a bunch of people trying to make sure the university was fully accessible. Then it expanded to the city around it, and then it expanded to a sort of more national and then international movement, trying to make sure that disabled people were in charge of their services. Things are very different when we look at the global level, right? When we look at the global level, and here I'm looking at the 3 problems of global inequality, first and foremost, we have a big problem about anarchy at the international level. What do I mean by that? Well, just like the welfare state, at least as we understand it in Canada, you know, the United Nations and global order as we know it today really emerged after the Second World War. Okay? So the United Nations emerges, and its Security Council, made up of the victorious powers of after the Second World War, it's attempting to come in and kind of stamp a global government onto the world, where the League of Nations had failed before that, and where treaties before that had not really worked out. Now, the Security Council is, you know, concerned about the security of states. Countries like the United States and France and Russia all have vetoes, right? So we really see the ways that the Second World War kind of divided the world, stamped into the United Nations Security Council. But nobody's really in charge. Okay? So one of the major problems that we have when we look at the independent living movement at a global level, or the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, is there's no real mechanism to kind of enforce who's going to make sure these rules are followed, and there's no real system to determine which country is going to dictate which particular rules we're going to follow. So this is, I think, very important if you read some of the material today, because, you know, the United Nations and its member states through the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities can say, we want all disabled people to have meaningful education for sexuality, for instance, which we'll talk about next class, but there's no way to enforce it. Okay? So here we have a sort of very aspirational model of disability rights, but it's very difficult to see how we can make sure those rights are enforced. In the US, you have the state of California, you have the University of California at Berkeley, and you have American laws. Those are kind of putting independent living to work, whereas here we don't really have that way of enforcing the rules. So the first thing has to do with whose rules that kind of make it difficult to enforce a convention on disability rights or anything else, because nobody's really in charge. Secondly, and this relates to the stuff on Marta Russell's work on the money model or the labor model or materialist model of disability, right? Talking about how disability rights don't really mean much unless people have work, right? We need a material backing for rights. There's a big question about who's going to finance the projects that kind of put independent living to work at the global level. And there's also a big question about inequality between member states. Why is that important? Well, we can say, looking at California in the 60s, that disabled people wanted to be in charge of their Medicare spending, or they wanted to be in charge of their rehabilitation treatment, right? And we could say that those subject to the independent living movement in California at the time probably had the same level of services, and they probably had the same level of access to community supports, to medical supports, etc. But when we look at the global level, and I'll embarrass you again here, Madison, when we look at the global level in terms of places like Ethiopia or Guatemala, we've got some member organizations in one of the studies I'm doing that represent these countries. We have a very different understanding of what disability is. We have a very different apparatus for what we can give disabled people. And the priorities of a state like Canada or the United States that have a kind of robust industrialized or post-industrial economy are very different if we look to places that are relatively have far fewer resources, right? So when I talk about who pays, I'm not just talking about disability supports being expensive, but I'm also talking about we sort of have a one-size-fits-all policy for addressing human dignity for disabled people, but not everybody can afford it at the same rate. Okay? So we have a question of rules, but we also have a question of resources. Okay? And then finally, and I think one of the most important things that's going to come up in the readings this week is we have to come to an agreement that disabled people have a sort of unified voice in the independent living movement, right? Ultimately, this movement is designed for people with disabilities to become meaningfully in charge of their lives. Maybe that means interdependence, maybe that means independence, and we'll talk about that difference in a second. But when we have a global movement, we have to ask about what sorts of people with disabilities are being represented, what are the kinds of inequalities that manifest within the international disabled people's movement, and how do the kind of problems we see in the independent living movement get reproduced at the global scale. That is, earlier we saw with the social model and with the independent living movement that it was mostly white guys who had acquired physical disabilities that were sort of leading the charge. If we have a global disability rights movement, who's the spokesperson or spokespeople? And what levels of power and privilege do they have? And how do they reproduce those other issues about anarchy in the international order or inequality of resources? Okay, so what I want to say is that the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is an attempt to sort of scale up independent living from a local thing in California to the global scale. But like any way of managing global issues, we have to think about these three major problems. Okay, so here's Article 19 of the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Again, a lot of text going on there, but just like we looked through the National Disability Insurance Scheme criteria in the last lecture, I think we're going to see a lot of the kind of disability politics that we've looked at so far reflected in this particular way of thinking about independent living, okay? So Article 19 is the article that sort of addresses questions about independent living and being included in the community. I know you can read it, I'm gonna read it too, but I think if we read it, we're gonna see some of these images of disability politics come up, okay? So states parties to the present convention recognize the equal rights of all persons with disabilities to live in the community, with choices equal to others, and shall take effective and appropriate measures to facilitate full enjoyment by persons with disabilities of this right and their full inclusion and participation in the community, including ensuring that A, persons with disabilities have the opportunity to choose their place of residence, where and with whom they live on an equal basis with others and are not obliged to live in a particular living arrangement. B, Persons with disabilities have access to a range of home, residential, and other community support services. Sorry, camera's in the way. Including personal assistance necessary to support living and inclusion in the community and to prevent isolation or segregation from the community. And then C, community services and facilities for the general population are available on an equal basis to persons with disabilities and are responsive to their needs. Okay, so the first thing I want to think about is this question of choice. So either in the chat or through that feedback tool, why do we think in section A here, there's a point about choosing the place of residence and not being obligated to live in a particular living arrangement? So obviously we're talking about the history of institutionalization here. Why do we think that this is crucial to sort of organizing the independent living movement on a global scale? Like, why is it, do we think, that choice of place of residence is kind of so high up in the hierarchy of the concerns of the independent living movement? Or maybe I can pose this a different way. Why is the independent living movement, through the Article 19, why are they so concerned about that choice? What's the thing that people are worried about? Okay, so somebody said equal rights. Absolutely. When we're talking about equal rights, we're saying, you know, if somebody is a Canadian, you have the ability to reside within whichever province. And, you know, for instance, I commute between Kingston and Montreal. Even though I have to access certain Quebec services if I want them only in French, or if I submit income tax there, I have to submit to Revenue Quebec and Revenue Canada, not just Revenue Canada. I can move wherever, okay? So yes, equal rights to choose where you live is something that people with disabilities are concerned about. But what's the fear? Like, thank you for the contribution. And so with that contribution that your colleague made about equal rights, what's the fear that's going to happen if disabled people don't have that equal right to choose their living arrangement? Well, we're going to see this come up throughout this this lecture, but Mladenov's also going to argue that one of the problems with translating the needs of the community is that often member states will say, well, the best way that we can support people with disabilities is by providing institutions for them. And people like Mladenov are really worried that we're simply going to rename older forms of institutionalization. So your colleague is absolutely right in saying equal rights are the concern. The question here is, how do we establish a protocol so that member states don't provide independent living through institutions like we used to? Like if you go and talk to a lot of folks working in rehabilitation medicine, everybody's going to say they promote independence. But what people like Mladenov and the other people in the global independent living movement are arguing is that, you know, we need to make sure that that independence is realized in the community and in a meaningful way, serving disabled people. Right, so one of your colleagues wrote, the ability to live with others, not seen to only live in institutions as a form of care. That's absolutely right. So when we look at this portion A of Article 19, we see that disabled people and the disability rights movement is very much worried about real choices, right? If the choice is between paying for your own apartment or living in an institution, you don't really have a choice. So meaningful choice means also having the resources to make that choice. Okay, and thank you again for the comments. We're going to see these same sorts of things come up in sections B and section C. Okay. Now, one of the other major concerns we're going to see here is that not only do we want disabled people to live in dignity, but we want disabled people to make the same choices as anybody else. Okay. So embedded within Article 19, yes, there's like an aspiration of disabled people should have these things, but they should also get there through the same path as anybody else. Okay? So all of this bundles together with the points that you folks have picked up on. Equal rights and the ability to live with others as a choice is very important for the disability rights movement through this article. Now, we can't read this in isolation of the rest of the piece and the rest of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is going to stake out all sorts of different ways that disabled people should have their human rights received and understood. Okay, so this isn't the only thing that talks about disability or community life, but this is the one that speaks about independent living, disability, and community life directly. Okay, now I could say exactly the same thing about B and C, but I think you've got the point. Fundamentally, what matters is that disabled people are in charge, or they have agency in this process, and that they have the choice to live as anybody else. Okay, so we can see that the independent living movement, as we've talked about, is sort of going from disabled people being masters of their destinies at the University of California, Berkeley, to the city of Berkeley, to the state of California, to the US, and now at the global scale. So Mladenov is not simply an idealist. He doesn't say, if we come up with the best understanding of disability rights, the most logical, the most easy to implement form, member states are just going to do it. He's not arguing that. In fact, he's very worried that the kind of spirit of the independent living movement is going to be lost because the only way we can implement any of these international agreements is through local policy, right? You can go to New York, or you can go to Geneva to the World Health Organization, or you can go to any international space, and you can talk a big game, but the only way that disabled people in any country are going to receive these rights is if they're implemented by a national state. Okay? So, yeah, we're talking about the United Nations, but ultimately we're talking about the government of Canada and the government of Ontario, and those are the only ways that these sort of global rights are actually going to touch any particular bodies. Okay, so why do I say this? I say this because all of the welfare state institutions that we've been talking about are still implicated in this story, right? So we're still talking about national healthcare, we're still talking about national policy or provincial policy on daycare and childhood, we're still talking about education and so forth. This adds another layer, but it doesn't replace those other layers. Now, one of the things that we've talked about in this course is how the welfare state really started to be threatened first in the 1970s. And if you've been paying attention to global capitalism lately, we're constantly in crisis. Mladenov is writing the critical social policy piece in wake of the 2008 crisis in England, but we can see the same sort of crises with COVID. We can see the same sort of crises in the late 90s, and we see this crisis manifest in 2008. So what Mladenov wants to do is to say, yeah, I want disability rights to be realized in national policies, but we also have to be really careful about the economic situation in which those national policies are being put to work. Okay? So the key thing to understand here are the politics of austerity. So when we're talking about austerity, we're talking about states or governments more general being more worried about resource spending. And we're seeing that a lot of the worries about resource spending translate into policies that are more more oriented towards the market. So you can call this neoliberalism if you want. You can call this austerity. You can call this budget management. But ultimately, we're talking about governments being concerned about where money is going. Governments are concerned about tracing where that money is going, about accountability, and about making sure that the stated goals of programs are being realized. Okay, so on this slide, we're looking at the politics of personalization and how they fall with austerity. When we're talking about personalization, we're talking about policies that target individuals rather than communities as a whole. And that's going to become very apparent as we look at economic supports for people on ODSP on the next slide. Okay, but what I want to do is to show the kind of goals of the independent living movement and the kind of threatening translation that happens once we have market-oriented services or market-oriented policies. What are some of the dangers that come up there? Okay, so what Mladenov wants to argue, and what many people in the independent living movement want to argue, is we're not just talking about independence in terms of each individual sort of being isolated, being one person who only makes decisions on their own horizon of choices, independent of a social context. No, Mladenov is going to say, well, fundamentally, independent living is about interdependence. So disabled people are going to lead services, or they want to be meaningfully included in their choices, but they're not the only people who are going to act on those choices. Okay, so yeah, we're talking about independent living because you want somebody to be able to make their choices, but they don't consider, enact, and fund those choices in isolation. Right? So we can think about how I might make choices with my occupational therapist. In an independent model, I would do my own occupational therapy or physiotherapy or whatever. But ultimately, in an interdependent model, I make choices with that person, and together we affirm my independence. So independence isn't the start of the process, it's the conclusion. But what Mladenov is arguing in the critical social policy piece with his two colleagues is very often states that are concerned about spending are going to think about independence strictly in terms of individualism. Okay, so all of those other things that make me an interdependent and choice-having person in the interdependence model, right? Having access to the money to get rehabilitation, being able to access social services, etc. All of those things put me in a web with a bunch of others. But the threat, and we're going to see this in the next slide, the threat of a sort of austerity or personalization in politics is that we lose all this stuff. So just like we looked at the slide with the Article 19, many of the problems that Mladenov is worried about genuine choice are going from genuine choice to individuals making the only choice they have. So you can live in an institution on the state's dime, or you can pay for your own apartment, and that's it. That's independence, but it doesn't reflect the spirit of interdependence that Mladenov wants to put forth. Okay? Secondly, and we're going to go through the same way of thinking on each of these three criteria. Secondly, when we think about independent living, we think about anti-institutionalization, right? In this course, we're going to look at Jen Rinaldi's piece on the Huronia Institution and some of the deep and traumatic memories that people who used to live there and be managed there in this Ontario institution have about that total institution, right? So people with disabilities had to live in this institution because it was believed they couldn't live anywhere else. And those institutions have their own rules. This is what Irving Goffman has talked about in asylums, etc. Okay, so the independent living movement says we need to get out of here, right? This is the problem. This is why we need interdependence and not independence in housing choices. We need to get out of institutions because these are not the only way to guide a disabled person's life or to live a life with disability. And these institutions simply don't allow human dignity for anybody. Now, the threat that we see when we start looking at austerity or personalization in politics is that these services that were offered in institutions aren't offered when we get on the outside. Okay, so one of the ways to think about this is to think about things like food or other basic necessities of everyday life, right? If you're in an institution, yes, life is miserable, but individuals are fed, right? Some of the basic necessities of life are met. And with the decline of those institutions, we need to still be able to pay for our groceries, to pay for bus fare or other services. You know, there are essential things that any person needs, and those things need to be provided if we're going to actually realize our interdependence, right? So one of the big worries with the reduction in institutions is that we don't actually receive those services in the world after institutionalization. Like, is it better to be locked up in an institution than be a free person? Of course not. But with those institutions, there was a provision of basic living that in many cases we don't see elsewhere. Institutions are really expensive to run. I'm sure anybody who's taken a criminology course knows how much it costs to house people, how much it costs to feed people, how much it costs to pay employees who live there. We're not saying what they're doing is great, and we're not saying what they're doing is bad. It just costs a lot of money. So as governments are looking to reduce institutionalization, Mladenov's deeply worried that services are not going to be replaced, even if they were, given to you in a terrible way, like they are within institutions. Okay, so anti-institutionalization is the aim, but one of the big worries about the independent living movement internationally, and this is why we saw on the last slide housing choices were so important, is that we're worried that services simply aren't going to replace the old ones. So if we had an institution where disabled people used to live, and those institutions close, and instead we manage disability as a childhood issue through childhood tax policy, for instance, we're just replacing a bigger institution with the institution of the family. There's no real choice involved for the people who are subject to it. Okay, and then finally, the independent living movement is really opposed to this understanding of disability paternalism. Okay, so when we're talking about paternalism, maybe the concept of patriarchy comes up. Yeah, we're talking about the model of the father in terms of guiding the destiny of others who might not be able to do so on their own. So one of the major components of independent living is to move authority from experts, maybe medical, maybe bureaucratic, maybe tax experts, maybe religious experts. We're talking about the whole global society here, right? What the independent living movement is trying to do is to eliminate paternalism and get disabled people to be in charge of their lives. One of the concerns, and this is going to come up again in the next slide, is that when we go from a system of disability policy that's made on rights being afforded to people, right? When we go from a model of disability rights where we have, we looked at the French example, or we can look at the Canadian example, where we go from a system of disability rights where goods, services, and resources are allocated by experts to one where individuals are in charge of their own lives, we sort of have an authority figure present who's changed for the anarchy of the market. When I mean that, I mean there's this sort of rationale in maybe what we'll call neoliberal policy or market-oriented policy, that it's not the business of the government to pick winners and losers in the economy, right? If I'm the government and I say, well, we're going to give a bunch of money to this software company and not this one, we're really just promoting a sort of patronage between the market and the government, right? So Shopify is going to be calling Mark Carney all the time, asking for handouts, and every other sort of market actor is at a huge disadvantage. But by doing so, we actually just make Shopify or whatever enterprise more dependent on the government, and we kind of eliminate all market competition. So there's this general tendency in market-oriented government to say, look, we're just trying to get people to get their skills out there, and employers and firms can make choices about what skills they need, right? The concern here is that nobody's driving the bus, right? If we have a disability policy that's free of paternalism, but left subject to the market, and we're going to talk about employment markets in a second, nobody's in charge, and nobody's going to be able to guarantee that people's rights are respected. Okay? So in each of these kind of major aims, focusing on interdependence, anti-institutionalization, and the problem of paternalism, the independent living movement at a global scale and those who are shaping the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, right, are very worried that personalization is going to degrade the real choices that disabled people have about their lives, right? If you are stuck between institution and finding your own way on the street, you don't have a real choice, and you're probably going to stick in that institution if it still exists. Even if you received paltry services or dehumanizing services in an institution, we have to ask, are the replacements for those institutions enough to keep people alive? Okay. And then finally, the major concern about personalization and austerity, and this can be in England, this can be in Canada, this can be in Guatemala, right, is this concern about paternalism. So if the market's going to decide what's best, what does that mean for disabled people? And here we can see some of those economic critiques that somebody like Marta Russell or Mike Oliver talked about coming up again. We have to think about the way the economy looks at work and looks at people, and that's a real danger, especially for disabled people who are disadvantaged in terms of market outcomes, housing and non-housing assets, all the stuff we've talked about in this course so far. Okay, so while Mladenov and his colleagues are worried about English policy and austerity in England in 2008, you're going to see exactly these same concerns and exactly these same trends in pretty much every welfare state or in any country that's sort of going through, we'll say, structural adjustment programs or other international development programs that are kind of oriented towards the market economy. Okay, so this is all pretty abstract, and so I thought I'd just give you an example of employment supports in Ontario. And I've stolen this example from Rebecca Gewurz's dissertation. It's at the bottom of the slide here. If you're interested in disability and employment policy in Ontario, you can Google her name, and she'll be in some of those journals that we've talked about. Okay, so if you want to use an example like this one, you can always use this particular reference to find other references. Her dissertation's online, and it's got a bunch of references in its reference section, and you could use those to find material. Okay, so in Ontario, if you are on disability, as we say as an expression, you're on the Ontario Disability Support Program. Okay, so in 1997, the Ontario Works Act separated Ontario Works welfare from the Ontario Disability Support Program. Okay, for Ontario Works, you have to prove that you're looking for a job all the time. To get on ODSP, that is how you get money every month from the government, you have to have it proven that you have a disability, that it's permanent, your doctor signs off on a very extensive application form, and you are supported so long as you meet certain requirements. You have to still be disabled, you can't have too many assets, so on and so forth. We've talked about that program quite a bit, but there are also supports that are designed to get people jobs. Okay, so with the Ontario Disability Support Program came an Ontario Disability Support Program set of employment supports, and these are services that are supposed to help people get off of ODSP and get them into the market. Okay, so I'm going to keep talking about this, but I want to ask, can somebody tell me, why is the government so invested in something like employment supports? Like, why would the government have a perfectly good system that addresses poverty for those who haven't found work for the moment, and poverty for those who can work? Why is the government so interested in providing employment supports? Like, what's in it for them? So I'll put that question out there as I'm going to keep going. Okay? So what Gewurtz does in this piece is look at the changes that happened in employment supports from 2006, from before 2006, when there was a services first model, to after 2006, when there is a market first model. What do I mean by that? So before 2006, you could go to any service provider. So think about, say, like March of Dimes, or you could go to the YMCA, or you could go to any service provider who is funded by the government. That service provider would get a block of money based on how many people it served, or that service provider would get a block of money based on a target, and they would meet a certain number of people and do whatever they could to get that person a job. So, and one of your colleagues wrote, it helps build the economy. Yes. So the reason that these supports existed were to build the economy, but also to make it so Ontario didn't have to pay for these people to live every day, right? Every single time somebody gets a job and is able to support themselves, they're off of the Ontario Disability Support Program. Okay, so yes, it helps build the economy. Very good point. And the ways that the government tried to build the economy through the services first model was have a bunch of people and say, okay, disabled person, what do you want to do and how do we get you there? Right? So maybe we would give people services to be able to write their resume. I know at Queen's, there's a career services that you folks can go to, and you can go and get them to look and say, here's how we'd organize your resume better. But we're talking about other services too. So we might also have a job bank, right? So the person at the YMCA or at March of Dimes, these are just examples. I don't know what the service providers are, but what matters is that we have a non-governmental organization that is funded by the government to help get people into the market. So maybe we would, like Abrams, buy a used suit for their job interview. Or maybe we would give people insight into markets they hadn't looked at. Or maybe your service provider has, a bunch of ergonomic stuff or a bunch of other, maybe a prosthetic or a specialized keyboard. Maybe the service provider is able to set up a market where people sell used stuff that they don't need anymore, and we can help get people to the market. Okay, so in this model, services are sort of the object. Ultimately, we will pay groups to help get disabled people the services they need, and this will get them into the market. Okay, so you could go in and you could say, well, you know what? I've really wanted to be an artist, or I've really wanted to be able to, I don't know, do other people's taxes, but I need this kind of monitor, or I want to get these kinds of skills, right? I want to be a bookkeeper, I want to be an artist. And the service provider would say, okay, we're going to do what we can for you. Now, in 2006, the government said, you know what, I don't think we're not getting our return on investment here, right? This is how we have to think if we're thinking about things in a kind of market-oriented way. If my stocks are doing terribly, I might consider selling them and buying other ones. Or if my factory isn't doing well because I'm, producing what I'm producing inefficiently, or the market says, you know what, turns out nobody's buying Labubus anymore, we're moving on to the next cool thing, well, then I have to adapt. The market's made a choice and I have to adapt. So in 2006, the government of Ontario said, this old system of services isn't working, and we need to put in a kind of market-based model. Okay, so in the old system, you would go to a service provider and they would say, okay, here's what we can do for you, and we're going to help you out no matter what. In the new model, service providers still get people into the workplace, but they only get paid when those people get jobs and when those people keep jobs. Okay, so on the one hand, in the services first model, we simply give a portion of money to a service provider to get people to work, and we hope that happens. In the market first model, the government says, okay, service provider, if this person works for 6 weeks, we will give you $1,000, I believe is the amount of money. And if your person who you've supported gets a job for 13 weeks, you will get a larger sum of money. They've also offered a sort of continuing employment bonus. So if that person stays in that job, we will give the service provider who got them there a small amount of money to keep them going. Okay? So the ways that we fund these particular services are really important. On the one hand, anybody could go and ask for services to help get them a job. And in this new model, anybody could go get these services, but service providers are only really paid for those who land employment and meet certain marks. Okay? So we're still talking about the labor market, but we're talking about two very different ways of getting people there. Now, can I ask, can one of you tell me, what do we think are some of the concerns about this kind of model? Right? We have one model that outfits people for the labor market with whatever skills they'd like to develop, right? We teach the skills directly, and we fund these groups who are doing this work sort of at a block rate. In the next model, right, we have the market first model. We're paying those who've succeeded in getting people to work, as bookkeepers or work at Shoppers Drug Mart or whatever. What matters is they have a job. In the second model, the labor market is kind of picking the people. We're just helping those who helped the labor market pick the people. And payment is paid out at specific milestones, which is that 6 weeks and 13 weeks duration, as well as a continuing bonus. So what might be some of the unintended consequences of this kind of model? As you're thinking through that, we can look at some of the ones that Gewertz talks about in her dissertation. She's arguing that those people living with mental illness are often the most stigmatized in the labor market. So in the services first model, it doesn't matter who you are and what kind of disability you have, right? You can go into a service provider and get some skills given to you, but the amount of funding that you get, it's just bodies in the door, right? So if a person has a significant mental illness, I'm still going to give them the resume session, or I'm still going to give them the same training as somebody with a physical disability. However, in the market first model, we can see that forms of inequality within the disability category really determine who gets the real services, right? If my bread and butter is I only get that if I get somebody into a job, I'm probably only going to provide services to those people who I know can get those jobs. Okay, so one of your colleagues pointed out exactly what I'm saying. Service personnel may want to work with people they think will be easier to place into a job, creates another form of inequality and discrimination. You got it, okay? So we start to see that even though we have the same group of people who are served by this policy, and even though we're trying to get this same group of people into the labor market to reduce the burden on social services and to give them a better life, like it's a pretty miserable existence on $13,000 a year, we can see that there are other forms of labor market discrimination that might come up, and other forms of disability discrimination that are here. So one of the, I think, most important lines out of the Mladenov et al. Piece is when he says sometimes interdependence costs more, right? Like, if you look at things from a sort of very fiscally minded, very economically individualist perspective, it's always better to treat individuals as individuals. But what Mladenov and his colleagues are arguing is the labor market isn't there to support everybody. It's there to support the people who you can make the most money on. If you're a business, you want to make sure that having an extra employee means that you make more money, not less. So we can see that focusing on the market to solve problems of disability actually creates new forms of inequality. And this means that there are certain disabled people who are, just not able to receive these services because it's not worth it for the service providers that are doing it. So Gewurz is going to say, well, this ultimately makes us think, like, what is the point of these employment services? Like, are we giving people skills so they can eventually find a job that gives them dignity? Are we just looking to place anybody in any job? And if we don't offer services to people because we don't think the market will employ them, aren't we just reproducing the exact same problem we're trying to get out of? So if we look at disability employment supports in Ontario, we see a really good example of the three things and the three worries that we talked about before, right? If we only are going to try to train people who could already get jobs in the first place, we're not establishing interdependence. We're just looking at people independently. Again, we're getting away from the sort of sheltered workshop where disabled people did menial tasks for pennies on the dollar, but we're sort of letting the discriminating market do the decision making for us, right? So yeah, the government's out of the discrimination game, but the alternative is much worse. Okay, and we can see that some of the minor benefits of institutionalization are going to kind of fall apart, right? If you go to a service provider to learn how to use a lathe or to learn how to use Microsoft Excel, at least you're in a warm building for the day. You know, you're not stuck out in the snow in Kingston like, unfortunately, some of the members of community are today. Okay, so again, when we look at independent living at the international scale, we only realize these things through national policies or provincial policies. The ways that independent living is being translated or can be translated, it's through this sort of market-based logic, which is convenient for governments because they don't want to spend money. But there are very real consequences that impact disabled people and their independence when we look at things only through the market logic. Okay, so ODSP employment supports is a very good example of the dangers of the market, but also a really good example of what's happening, which is institutions are market oriented, but they kind of shift obligations from governments to markets themselves. Okay, and then finally, I know there's some $10 words here, so I've done my best to define them on the slides. Mladenov is really worried about the politics of experience, right? So if we're going to have independent living, or if we're going to have a model of interdependence where people can make meaningful choices about their lives, we need to make sure that disabled people themselves are informing that movement, right? We need to make sure that disabled people have real choices in their lives rather than having a government say, well, the market will decide. Okay, so the concept of epistemic justice belongs to Miranda Fricker. That name isn't important, and the concept isn't really important except for what Mladenov is trying to do with it. Mladenov says that disabled people have to be at the forefront of the ILM movement, and the independent living movement model has to be responsive to the experience of disabled people. They have to be meaningfully in charge, not included in a tokenistic way. In terms of the Convention on the Rights of People with persons with Disabilities, This means disabled people actually have to be consulted when we look at ODSP employment supports, or the experience of disabled people has to be considered in terms of the choices they're making to live in one place or another. So what Mladenov is deeply worried about is governments saying, yeah, we're deeply committed to disabled people's human rights, but not including them in that conversation. Okay, so, and this is going to come up in terms of the next two objects on this slide here. But epistemic justice has to do with whose knowledge matters, whose knowledge is considered legitimate, and how that knowledge informs the policies that make independent living useful or not. Those things have to happen, and Mladenov is deeply worried about that. The example in one of the pieces, in the Altair piece, is Mladenov is deeply worried about the politics of translation. He's a Bulgarian man, very interested in post-Soviet disability policy. So how did states go from the Soviet Union to liberal democratic states in the European Union, and how did that change the services offered to disabled people? So in order to join the European Union, and in order to implement these particular policies, we need to translate the language of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities into other languages. There are some official translations and some non-official translations. Mladenov is using this translation as a metaphor. He's saying that governments also, when they translate it to different languages, but also translate policy from international to domestic realms, they see independence and not interdependence and act that way. So Mladenov is deeply worried about the politics of experience because he wants to make sure that the knowledge, the sort of experience of interdependence inspires the movement and not something else. So give people meaningful work, not the kind of work you get under the marketized supports for ODSP. Okay? Secondly, when Mladenov is talking about meaningful self-determination, he's saying there are services that affirm people's lives, and those services look very different than ones that just kind of keep them at home. Okay, so a lot of the independent living movement is about getting people from the front door of their house or their apartment out into the shared world. Whereas many personalized services today are about sending a nurse or sending a care worker to your home to support you. Mladenov is worried that this meaningful self-determination is lost, right? Yeah, someone can come and help you shower in the morning and help you get dressed, but if that's the end of the story, you're not a meaningfully independent person, right? You're not able to enter the world and be around others. So the services are personalized, but there's no self-determination involved. Okay, so Mladenov is deeply concerned that a lot of countries that are joining the European Union or that are trying to show that they are modern states for whatever reason are actually kind of using home care services or using pseudo-institutional services as things that might support people's interdependence. So this is another big concern for him. And then finally, and I made a joke about the existential philosophy and Bulgarian disability policy in the announcement, but this is really important. Mladenov is saying, yeah, we need to come up with a very legally sound set of principles that guide disability policy. Like that's essential. Like if we're going to have international law or international order, we have to make sure that the way that we build this is legally sound. But we can't let the law or member states, because we're always talking about individual governments, we can't let member states be totally in charge of the meaning or the language used to talk about disability and independence. Because those governments are the same ones that are changing Ontario Disability Support Program into the market model, right? So when we interpret the needs of disabled people, and when those interpretations make it into law, we can't just look to legal insiders, right? We can't just look to states that are trying to protect their state sovereignty. We have to ensure that disabled people and the movement, the independent living movement, is meaningfully included in their process. So he uses a bunch of fancy existential philosophy to make that point. But what I want you to think about is how legal meaning is always kind of couched in a greater set of social priorities. And Mladenov wants to make sure that this extra legal meaning, this meaning around the law, is always kind of guided by disabled people themselves. These are the kind of things that are threatened by a policy that looks to the market as the solution to all of our problems. And yet, Mladenov is arguing that the United Nations offers a space where disability advocates or disability scholars or just anybody interested in justice has a forum to create this meaning, right? So we're not just talking about the worry about member states wrecking everything. We also want to look at the international sphere and this particular law as places where disability rights advocates and disability rights concerned people can speak about meaningful interdependence and establish it.